Some people say I'm a classic. I'm just an old bloke from Liverpool. Sun Country Classic Wine Cool.
A clip there of Ringo I Love You by Bonnie Jo Mason, a novelty song rushed out in 1964 to capitalise on the Beatles' sudden American success. The clip before was the first time a Beatle ever publicly endorsed a product. We hardly need recap Ringo's glory years. Suffice to say, he lived in a yellow submarine with a little help from his friends, Octopus's Garden. But what happened next took the only Beatle Cher sang a love song to. Oh yeah, I forgot to say, Bonnie Jo Mason believed in life after love.
Do you believe in life after?
And placed him in cahoots with a polar bear hawking Alka-Pops in the 80s.
I was supposed to bring the cooler, you were gonna bring the chips.
This outcome hinged on his bizarre post-Beatles decision to quit drumming, which he's lauded for, to focus on singing, which he's ridiculed for. What led to this decision? Why, in fact, was it the only choice open to him? This is the curse of Ringo Starr. They won't stop.
Hey, it's classy, just like me.
A drummer. Not even a real musician, he just makes a noise.
You don't know what you're talking about.
The biggest band in the world was also one of the most respected, so when the Beatles ended, each member had two resources to draw from: mainstream appeal and credibility. The three respected artists of the band could draw from both, but for Ringo, this was a fork in the road. Seen as a regular guy who got lucky, he could exploit his mainstream appeal by being a pop star, but he'd be a novelty act, which would destroy his credibility as a musician. If he pursued credibility by, say, joining another band, he'd miss the chance to trade on his name while it was still hot. So, pop stardom or credibility? Singing or drumming? As a drummer, Ringo is now seen as one of the greats, his tempo rock solid and with a feel all his own. The entire Beatles tape archive of nearly 200 songs over thousands of takes contains fewer than a dozen instances of a take breaking down thanks to him. But in the 60s, his flat singing and iffy songwriting saw him labelled the untalented one. That's why he was the subject of a novelty song, because singling Ringo out for your affections was a novelty. His often basic beats meant the ridicule bled over to his playing too, so he was mocked as much for the thing he was great at as the things he kinda sucked at. If he cared about being taken seriously, to him it probably looked like he had no greater chance behind the kit than at the mic. Still, drumming was his passion. As a kid, he could barely sit still without tapping on something. So what gave? For one, opportunity. Too old for pop, too lightweight for rock, all drumming avenues must have looked like dead ends post-Beatles. No new band could live up to them, no established band would want him overshadowing them. Also, in the age of the flashy hard hitter, Moon, Mitchell, Bonham, Baker, Ringo's simple style looked tame. For two, ego. The choice between singing and drumming was also the choice between ego and humility. It was inevitable that after 8 years as the fourth coolest person on earth, Starr had developed an ego. The choice between being front and centre with your name in lights versus staying at the back was a no-brainer. For three, money. Starr was hardly poor, but was the hardest hit financially when the Beatles stopped touring, having the smallest songwriting income by far. Being a pop star meant the chance to earn more than he had since the days of Beatlemania, especially if he wrote the songs. But I don't think any of those are the main reason he chose singing, but regardless, he chose it. So let's find out how he got on, shall we?
I've been into classic things all my life. Classic rings, classic clothing, classic news.
I'm in love with him and I intend to marry him.
If he played the violin or the piano, anything that made sense, but the drums.
In 1983, Ringo completed his 9th solo album, Old Wave. The product of 4 months of writing, this LP by a former Beatle, produced and co-written by a former Eagle, had guest appearances from Eric Clapton, John Entwistle and the man who co-wrote Whiter Shade of Pale, and nobody wanted to touch it with a barge pole. The boss of the small label Starr had been on died the previous year, and now he found himself with no contract and no takers. For context, here's a rundown of Starr's 3 previous albums. 1977's Ringo Starr,
I've been down one time.
an attempt to move with the times by going disco. It tanked. He was dropped by Atlantic in the US, and in the UK, Polydor tried to rush through some of his remaining contract by putting him on a children's album called Scouse the Mouse.
I'm the scout, that's Scout the mouse. He's the greatest. No ordinary, I'm an extraordinary.
1978's Bad Boy sought to undo the damage by sticking to the formula. There was a star-studded tie-in special on NBC featuring Angie Dickinson, Mike Douglas, Vincent Price and John Ritter. I just said that. They also managed to snag Tony Iommi, who introduced the plot, which was twins 15 years early.
It seems 2 babies were born, the very same moment, the very same second.
It tanked, along with the album, and he was dropped by his American and British labels. 1981's Stop and Smell the Roses had songwriting by Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Harry Nilsson, Ronnie Wood and Stephen Stills. Here's the great Paul McCartney's contribution.
Private property, don't run off with it. You'll be breaking the law.
It tanked, and his contract with RCA was cancelled. His solo career had started strong, with a Beatle-grieving public eager to throw money at their remnants, and his early singles maximised his limited charms. Back Off Boogaloo pushed his drumming, others had Beatley harmonies or George Harrison guitar breaks. He outsold his 3 bandmates on occasion, and famous friends rallied round to donate songs and do guest spots. But the Fool's Paradise titled Ringo Starr, singing sensation, was destined to crumble. In the Beatles, his blokey vocals were a humanising crack in the band's armour of perfection, but few wanted a whole album of that. Especially one full of spare songs his fading celebrity mates thought too poor for their own often patchy albums. Inevitably, the public began to drift away. Britain turned its nose up at a single written by its then darlings Elton John and Bernie Taupin. Starr admits he stopped trying, leaving his producers to assemble tracks and then turning up to just bosh down a vocal.
That's when I can see you lying next to me.
After 1976, he barely tickled the charts, and now, in 1983, he had an album he couldn't give away. Eventually, Old Wave had a limited release on RCA Canada and a small German independent. Needless to say, it was not a smash. A few months later, it was the 20-year anniversary of the event that once sparked the hasty creation of Ringo I Love You. In January 1964, the Beatles went to #1 in America. Now, in January 1984, a more dismal landmark. Starr's final solo release of the 80s, a promotional 7-inch titled I Keep Forgetting, pressed in Mexico only. He'd finally ground to a halt on this path he was never really cut out for. But why was he on it in the first place? I noticed you admiring my coffee. Exhausted? Broke? Never miss a moment's penury with honest value coffee, a cup of which can render sleep a real challenge. I can't afford not to drink it, for the budget pick-me-up that never quits. Just sip, pinch, tip and swallow. Before the Beatles, Ringo played in Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and he used to sing for them too, during a nightly spot called Star Time. When he joined the Beatles, he brought his singing spot with him. The songs he chose were corny 12 bars and novelty sing-alongs, and later, his heart stayed rooted in those corny stylings. What's clear now is that despite his early obsession with drums and his key role at the centre of a cultural revolution, at heart, Starr was a cheeseball entertainer. He was bound to want to step from behind the kit eventually, but these cornball tastes and that flat voice meant that when he did, it was with all the poise of a jolly uncle at a wedding having a go on the karaoke machine.
Drowning in the sea of love.
This was his curse. He had the soul of an entertainer, but all his talent was at the back of the stage. That talent would eventually see him ranked among the great drummers, but only decades later, because he made it so hard to take him seriously. He traded a calling for a taste of the spotlight, but the things he did in that spotlight reinforced the public's image of him as a clown, an image he would never now fully shake.
Shit, the Beatles were so high, they let Ringo sing a couple of tunes. Tell me they weren't partying.
And if you're thinking, so what? If he was happy doing all that, more power to him. The guy was miserable. If he had been loving his life, then yeah, everything I've said would just be a load of hipster carping. Why couldn't the man from the band stay cool forever like I wanted? But he wasn't loving life. As a performer rather than an artist, he had no vision, and once said, I'd just pick out songs I thought were vaguely trying to say what I would have liked to say. These songs were presented with no unifying theme besides Starr's toothless geniality. He once named an album after a printing press for no particular reason. Goodnight Vienna was presented with a UFO sci-fi theme because one song mentioned the Milky Way, I guess. And although he was ahead of his time in some ways, he was mostly like an empty vessel, passively hoping to have something decent poured into it. The same thing sank his acting career. With nothing guiding his choice of projects, his early promise was squandered on one campy bit of trash after another.
The right moment for the operation is almost upon us.
Oh, but Emmanuel is good boy.
Can't get the camera inside your pants.
Soon his acting was viewed the same way as his singing, the work of a chancer, pushing his luck. Along the way, he estranged himself from his true talent, barely drumming except on rare visits to the studio, and his once youthful hedonism curdled into full-blown alcoholism. In 1976, he suddenly shaved all his hair and eyebrows, later saying it was a time when you either cut your wrists or your hair, and I'm a coward. He began wearing shades in public to cover his bloodshot eyes. There were inebriated chat show appearances.
He's prettier than I am.
Roger Moore.
Much more fun sitting next to you.
I
know the answers. He knows the question.
Of the mid-80s, he would say, I didn't work or do anything. I wouldn't go out because you'd have to be in the car for 40 minutes without a drink. In short, he had an appointment to keep with a polar bear.
Got any munchies? Well, not quite what I had in mind.
By 1986, Starr had nothing to lose taking the Sun Country Classic Wine Coolers gig. And in answer to your question, a wine cooler was fizzy white wine with sugar and fruit flavouring.
It's crystal clear, has a dry, distinguished taste.
Starr was disappointed not to be wearing the polar bear suit himself, but that would have defeated the purpose of his famous face. The first spot ran in February '87. 20 years earlier, the Beatles hit peak innovation with the release of Strawberry Fields Forever. Now, Starr was selling booze while fast approaching the rock-bottom moment of his own alcoholism. Maybe it was some consolation that hardly anyone was buying. In fact, if you're getting cognitive dissonance trying to picture buying the 80s equivalent of Smirnoff Ice on the say-so of this man on this set, you're not alone. The summer quarter of the campaign was alone so disastrous it wiped out the company's profits for the whole year, then left them $10 million in the red. As his attempt to sell booze to the 18 to 35s market lay in tatters, Starr was sacked. To be fair, I doubt he cared. He still got paid 7 figures, and would that all our indignities could be so lucrative. But next year, 1988, came the event that shook him. As rock-bottom moments go, it was ugly enough that he got help, but unremarkable enough that I don't feel justified raking it up. Suffice to say, it was a lesser crime than murder, but a greater one than don't pass me by. Still, his rehab was a success. But now the fog had cleared, he still had to figure out what the hell to do with himself.
Ringo Starr and the All-Star Band.
The idea for the All-Star Band came from this guy, David Fishoff, a promoter of nostalgia tours. Just when Starr was newly sober and wondering what to do, Fishoff appeared as if by magic and pitched the thing that would become Starr's deal from this point on. The plan was to build an all-star band of name singer-songwriters who'd back Ringo while he sang his hits,
I get by with a little help from my friends.
and then he'd get on the kit and back them while they sang theirs. It wasn't going to win any awards, but it was perfect for him. Low pressure, cosy, fun. The first lineup had Nils Lofgren, Billy Preston, Dr. John, Joe Walsh, Levenhelm and Rick Danko. Starr said, "It's win-win. I'll get the chance to be the entertainer and the musician." The first tour sold out in minutes, and even though most of the truly big names he used to get have either tapped out or died, the tickets are selling to this day. And I hope any alcoholics watching this feel suitably inspired to quit, because no businessman's just going to approach you with a great way to leverage your name in a manner that's cosy, fun and lucrative while you're just lying there drunk. So come on! He did a new album in '92 called Time Takes Time, and it tanked. But he seems to have made peace with that and keeps making them regardless. He's still married to his long-term partner, Barbara Buck, and it's safe to say that Ringo has defeated his curse. As for me, well, I'm still being followed everywhere by that giant inverted rabbit's foot, and I asked David Fishoff to build a show around it, but you know what he said to me? "You're not famous enough." Curse you, Fishoff! If you like this content, please consider supporting the channel. Regular supporters on Patreon or Ko-fi gain access to bonus episodes, including 2 Beatle ones. Here is a freely available Beatles one. And remember, never